The Pacific Ocean, late 1943. Somewhere east of the Marshall Islands, a gray dawn seeps across a restless sea. Beneath it, 50 meters down, the Imperial Japanese Navy submarine I-36 moves like a silent shadow. Condensation drips from the steel ceiling. The smell of oil and sweat clings to the air. Through the narrow lens of the periscope, Lieutenant Commander Kudo scans the horizon. His crew stands wordless behind him, 25 men barely breathing. Then he sees them. On the far edge of the pale horizon, 3 silhouettes, flat-decked, rising and falling with the waves. Carriers. American carriers. A murmur ripples through the cramped control room. The moment Japan has waited for since Midway. Revenge within range. Kudo lowers the scope, whispers an order. Prepare tubes 1 through 6. Hydraulics hiss. Hands tighten around levers. The submarine tilts slightly, lining up for the kill. But above the surface, the decoy ships, their radar dishes hidden, their escorts circling in silence, drift deliberately across open water. They are bait, and the hunters below are moving straight into the snare. The ocean is calm, too calm, and these waters are not what they seem. By late 1943, the Pacific War had become a vast chessboard of invisible movements. The great carrier battles of Midway and the Coral Sea had already redrawn the map of naval power. Once the undisputed masters of the Pacific, the Imperial Japanese Navy was now bleeding. Its carriers crippled, its pilots lost, its fleets hunted across 1,000 miles of open ocean. In response, Japan turned increasingly to its underwater arm, the long-range I-class submarines. These were not the short-range ambushers of German design. They were massive steel leviathans built for reconnaissance, extended patrols, and coordinated attacks with surface fleets. Some even carried aircraft in waterproof hangars meant to scout far beyond the horizon. Each mission began the same way: silence, ritual, and faith in orders that often came from a world already slipping away. Crews departed from Kure or Truk, their decks crowded with fuel drums and spare torpedoes, their holds stuffed with rice, canned fish, and sake for the officers. They were told to locate, report, and, when possible, strike the heart of American naval movements. The Japanese command still believed that intelligence, not brute strength, could reverse the tide. If a submarine could find and strike a U.S. carrier task force, perhaps the Empire could slow the American advance. But by late 1943, America had learned the rhythm of Japanese patrols. The once unseen hunters were becoming predictable. Across the ocean, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commanding from Pearl Harbor, had reorganized the U.S. Navy into a machine of coordination and deception. Radar now scanned the skies and seas far beyond visual range. Cryptanalysts at Station Hypo in Hawaii had cracked portions of Japanese naval codebooks, providing vital clues to sub-patrol routes. Every Japanese transmission was a breadcrumb leading straight back to its source. When U.S. commanders realized that Japanese submarines were using radio reports to confirm sightings of American carriers, they saw an opportunity. If the enemy was looking for shadows on the horizon, why not give them shadows to find? Thus began one of the most intricate games of misdirection in modern naval warfare. Using radar reflectors, altered transmissions, and false task force signals, American fleet intelligence started to seed the Pacific with mirages. Some destroyers were disguised to appear through distant optics, like larger flat tops. Others transmitted carrier radio traffic. To a distant periscope or hydrophone operator, they seemed authentic. Meanwhile, Japan's remaining submariners, guided by imperfect orders and outdated charts, sailed through a shrinking empire. Fuel shortages forced them to move slowly, conserving every liter of diesel. Their torpedoes, once the terror of the Pacific, were now limited by both supply and reliability. Yet morale remained anchored in duty and tradition. For the men aboard the I-boats, the world outside the hull was mostly abstract. They lived by sound, the hum of engines, the creak of metal, the shifting of ballast tanks. Above them, entire fleets maneuvered, unseen and unheard. Below them, the ocean pressed with silent indifference. By November 1943, Japan's underwater fleet stretched thin across the Central Pacific. Some were ordered to reconnoiter the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, where the Americans were preparing a massive offensive, Operation Galvanic, the assault on Tarawa and Makin. Those submarines were told to shadow any approaching carrier groups and report immediately to headquarters. It was in this growing chaos that the illusion began to take shape. American Fleet Command, aware that Japanese subs were stationed east of the Marshalls, arranged several deceptive convoys designed to mimic the approach of carrier task forces. Each movement was baited with faint signals, echoing just enough authenticity to lure the watchers. And somewhere within that ocean of shadows, a Japanese submarine, the I-36, or perhaps one of her sister boats, intercepted what it believed to be a once-in-a-lifetime target. 3 American carriers, unguarded and moving slowly at dawn. The men inside did not know that what they saw was a phantom formation, a calculated mirage crafted to reveal their position. They believed they were the hunters. In truth, they were already being hunted. The trap was set. And from that moment on, every sound in the deep carried a question. Who was truly stalking whom? By the autumn of 1943, America had learned that strength alone could not win the Pacific. It needed perception. In a war fought across thousands of miles of empty ocean, what one side believed often mattered more than what it actually saw. And so, deception became a weapon as sharp as any torpedo. Inside the intelligence rooms of Pearl Harbor and Brisbane, radio specialists and cryptanalysts worked in near silence, deciphering Japanese signals hour by hour. The Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, FRUPAC, pieced together intercepted fragments of submarine transmissions, plotting their coordinates on vast wall charts. Each red pin represented a hunter beneath the waves. By cross-referencing radio patterns with previous patrol reports, U.S. intelligence officers began to predict Japanese submarine habits with uncanny precision. Meanwhile, Admiral Raymond Spruance and his staff studied how Japanese commanders reacted to perceived carrier movements. They noticed a pattern. Whenever a carrier task force was reported at sea, the nearest I-boats would converge toward its supposed route, regardless of risk. That single flaw, Japan's rigid adherence to centralized orders, became the opening move in America's counter-strategy. Under Nimitz's direction, fleet deception officers conceived a simple idea with profound consequences. If Japanese submarines could be drawn toward a false signal, they could be detected, tracked, and destroyed before they ever fired a shot. Thus, Operation Baitline was born, an unofficial name used within U.S. anti-submarine groups for the rotating convoys of decoy ships disguised as carrier elements. Old escort carriers, cargo ships with flat decks, and radar-enhanced destroyers formed these phantom task forces. From a distance, and through the narrow view of a periscope, they looked convincingly real. To complete the illusion, radio operators transmitted carefully scripted carrier traffic, coded coordinates, false aircraft launch orders, even simulated deck communications. Every word was designed to be overheard. In the vastness of the Pacific, truth became relative. To Japanese reconnaissance aircraft struggling to cover immense distances with dwindling fuel, these decoy formations were indistinguishable from genuine fleets. And when reconnaissance planes confirmed them, the information traveled up the chain of command, encoded, relayed, and trusted. Tokyo's naval headquarters received these reports with urgency. Each sighting promised redemption. a chance to strike back after Midway and Guadalcanal. Orders were issued to nearby submarines. Intercept at once. Maintain silence until in attack position. Yet even silence betrayed them. American radar-equipped patrol aircraft and destroyers had learned to listen for the faintest electronic whisper. A periscope radar pulse, a stray communication burst, the echo of a diesel engine surfacing to recharge batteries. Slowly, methodically, the U.S. Navy mapped the invisible battlefield. The psychological balance was shifting. For years, Japanese crews had been the predators, sinking tankers, transports, and even carriers with precision. But now the ocean itself seemed to turn against them. Each patrol grew more perilous, each surfacing more uncertain. Stories circulated through the fleet, submarines that never returned, convoys that vanished. Still, duty demanded persistence. In early 1944, the deception campaign intensified. During Operation Flintlock, the U.S. invasion of the Marshall Islands, multiple false radio nets transmitted alongside the real invasion force, creating a web of phantom fleets. The goal was simple: confuse Japanese command long enough for the real carriers to strike unopposed. The result was devastating. While the decoys lured I-boats into empty seas, the true American task forces hammered Japanese airfields and garrisons at Kwajalein and Roy Namur. When the submarines finally reported enemy carriers sighted, the information was already obsolete. The war's tempo had outpaced Japan's communication lines. Each delay in transmission meant the ocean changed shape before Tokyo could respond. For the men aboard the I-36 and her sister boats, the illusion felt real because it had to. Through the periscope, the horizon offered confirmation. Silhouettes of flat tops, columns of escorting ships, trails of wake cutting white against blue. In those moments, faith in the Empire's strategy overrode doubt. But unseen above the waves, American destroyers had already triangulated their position. Passive sonar arrays listened, depth charges waited, and aircraft patrols circled like hawks. The stage was set, not for victory, but for revelation. For in this ocean of mirrors, the line between hunter and hunted had finally vanished. The air inside a Japanese submarine was never clean. It carried the weight of weeks, of diesel exhaust, sweat, and tension. Each breath reminded the men how far they were from sunlight. Inside the steel shell, humanity had been compressed into a routine. Silence, obedience, endurance. For the crew of the I-36, duty was not questioned. Every man aboard had memorized the same code of conduct. Die for the Emperor if necessary, but do not fail in your mission. The youngest sailors were barely 20. Their world was metal corridors, narrow bunks, and the rhythmic hum of engines that never stopped. Some still wrote letters home, never mailed. Others found comfort in silence. When orders came to intercept a reported American carrier group, the atmosphere shifted. Jokes disappeared. The men shaved, cleaned the torpedo room, and stood a little straighter. Their commander, Lieutenant Commander Kudo, read from a small notebook, a naval directive from the combined fleet, then folded it back into his jacket. They knew the meaning. This could be the strike that turned fortune in Japan's favor. Human angle. Life inside the depths. A Japanese submarine in 1943 was both weapon and prison. It carried 60 or more souls in a vessel barely 100 meters long. Every corner was alive, valves hissing, bulkheads groaning under pressure. Hot air pressed against the skin. At depth, the temperature could reach unbearable levels. Condensation dripped constantly, soaking bedding and uniforms alike. Crewmen slept beside live torpedoes, their hammocks swinging inches from warheads. They ate rice mixed with pickled vegetables, sometimes spoiled from humidity. Fresh water was rationed. Conversation was minimal. The smallest sound could betray position. What sustained them was belief in the Emperor, in the Navy's honor, in revenge. But beneath that faith was quiet exhaustion. They had heard of submarines that never returned, of families receiving no word, no body, no closure. Yet still, when the periscope revealed the outlines of American carriers, the fire inside them returned. Every man aboard knew what a carrier meant. Hundreds of aircraft, the heart of the enemy's offensive power. To strike one was to strike America's will. Technological angle. The machines of deception. Japan's I-class submarines were masterpieces of range and endurance, some capable of sailing from Japan to the U.S. West Coast and back. They carried the Type 95 torpedo, an oxygen-propelled weapon with unmatched range and speed. Yet, for all their mechanical prowess, they were blind to a new era of warfare. Their periscopes, once instruments of precision, now betrayed them. The glass lenses reflected sunlight. American aircraft could spot a periscope wake from miles away. Their sonar systems were primitive compared to U.S. destroyers, and their radar sets, when fitted, often malfunctioned in humidity. The Americans, meanwhile, had turned deception into engineering. Dummy flight decks built on old tankers, radar reflectors that mimicked the electronic signature of fleet carriers, and even sonar countermeasures that imitated propeller rhythms. To a Japanese operator listening through headphones, the soundscape above could easily be mistaken for a genuine task force. The hunters were navigating a battlefield that no longer obeyed their senses. Strategic angle. The desperation of the empire by this stage of the war. Japan's naval command faced an impossible dilemma. Its surface fleet was shrinking faster than it could be repaired. Carrier strength was half of what it had been in 1942. American industry, fueled by thousands of workers and unlimited resources, launched new carriers faster than Japan could replace a single destroyer. The submarine force became the last tool of reach, a means to strike beyond the defensive line. Intelligence officers in Tokyo believed that if even one successful attack crippled a carrier group, it could delay the American advance toward the Marianas or the Philippines. Orders were issued to expand the range of reconnaissance, even into regions now dominated by Allied air patrols. The Imperial Navy's doctrine still imagined the ocean as it had been: vast, concealing, forgiving. It was not. By 1943, the Pacific had become an arena of transparency. American radar watched from the sky. Sonar listened from the deep. For the Japanese submariner, the strategic picture was invisible. He saw only orders, targets, and faith. He did not know that the Empire's encryption codes were being read, or that the carrier groups reported on his charts were phantom fleets. To him, the war still held symmetry. Two nations meeting through skill and courage. But the truth was colder. One side was already fighting with mathematics and machines, the other with memory and honor. Beneath the ocean that morning, the I-36 followed its coordinates toward what its commander believed was a genuine American formation. The crew adjusted ballast, trimmed depth, and prepared for firing range. They had no way of knowing that above them, an American destroyer had been tracking their position for nearly an hour. The next phase would be decided not by courage, but by comprehension. And soon, the men below would realize that the sea had changed its loyalties. Leadership angle. The weight of command in Tokyo. The once proud Imperial General Headquarters had become a room of shadows and whispers. Maps stretched across long wooden tables, dotted with red pins marking submarine patrol zones. Fleet officers leaned over them, voices hushed, eyes tired. Every report that reached them was delayed, distorted by the static of the Pacific Admiral Mineichi Koga, who had succeeded Yamamoto after his death in 1943, carried the unbearable burden of continuity. Yamamoto's death had already shaken Japan's faith in destiny. Koga now presided over an empire retreating on every front. His commanders urged restraint, conserve submarines for defensive operations, but the tone from Tokyo remained the same. Strike the American carriers, whatever the cost. The pressure on submarine captains like Lieutenant Commander Kudo was immense. Success was measured not in survival, but in impact. Every intercepted American ship was a potential victory for morale. Failure, on the other hand, was invisible, drowned somewhere in the sea, unspoken in Tokyo's reports. When Kudo received his orders to patrol east of the Marshalls, he knew they came not from tactical logic but from desperation. Still, his duty was clear. Leadership, in the Japanese sense, demanded obedience, not opinion. And obedience had become the empire's last defense against collapse. Enemy perspective. The eyes of the hunters, while the I-36 crept through the depths, the U.S. Navy observed from above with a precision that bordered on omniscience. In Pearl Harbor's underground war rooms, American officers stared at sound plot charts marked by faint rhythmic dots, echoes from Japanese propellers. Destroyers of the Fletcher class had become the new predators of the sea. Equipped with the QC series sonar and improved depth charge projectors, they could detect a submarine from hundreds of yards away. Radar aircraft patrolled the skies by day and night, their operators trained to recognize the smallest periscope wake. To them, the ocean was no longer a mystery. It was a network of coordinates, patterns, and probabilities. Admiral Raymond Spruance and his intelligence chief understood the psychology of their enemy as much as his strategy. They knew that Japanese submarines still adhered to Yamamoto's pre-Midway doctrine. Focus on decisive blows against large formations, not merchant ships. That rigidity made them predictable. Thus, when reports came of an I-boat operating near a decoy convoy east of the Marshalls, the Americans let the illusion unfold. They maintained silence, letting the submarine believe it had the element of surprise. Patrol aircraft stayed high above cloud cover. Destroyers adjusted speed to maintain the perfect sound profile of a carrier group. Every move was deliberate, rehearsed, and deadly. The goal was not only to destroy the submarine, but to learn from it, to record its communication patterns, its firing intervals, its escape routes. Warfare had become research. Every explosion, every sonar contact, added data to the next operation. Moral and psychological angle, pride and perception for centuries. Japanese warrior culture had been shaped by the idea of honor through sacrifice. The men of the Imperial Navy inherited that creed in every salute, every order. They believed that courage could overcome misfortune, that devotion could outlast defeat. But the ocean, impartial and vast, recognized neither devotion nor destiny. It rewarded adaptation. The tragedy of the Japanese submarine service was not cowardice or incompetence. It was belief. Belief that the Empire's code could withstand the logic of technology. Belief that their understanding of the enemy was still true. Inside the I-36, that belief was as real as steel. The men had faith in their instruments, their orders, and their purpose. The sound of propellers above was a promise, proof that they still had power to strike. They did not know they were hearing the sound of their own entrapment. In contrast, the American sailors above held a colder faith in systems, mathematics, and collective precision. They did not fight for ideology, but for outcome. They hunted by calculation, not passion. In that difference lay the essence of modern war. The moral weight of deception was discussed quietly among U.S. officers. Some questioned the ethics of luring men to certain death. Others argued that victory itself was mercy. Ending the war sooner meant fewer graves on both sides. History would not judge their hesitation, only their results. And so, two forms of faith met upon the same stretch of sea. One rooted in honor, the other in analysis. For the Japanese crew, The coming engagement was destiny fulfilled. For the Americans, it was a test of a theory. The I-36 continued its approach. Engines slowed to half speed. Torpedoes armed, depth steady at 60 meters. Through the periscope, Kudo confirmed range, 5,000 meters, bearing east-northeast. He believed he was about to strike history's balance. Above, sonar operators whispered to one another. Contact steady. Range closing. Target confirmed. The moment had arrived, and in that fragile silence between pursuit and discovery, the war itself seemed to hold its breath. The morning light broke through thin clouds, scattering gold over the surface of the Pacific. From beneath, it filtered as shifting beams through green water, an illusion of serenity over a killing ground. Inside the I-36, Lieutenant Commander Kudo stood motionless at the periscope. Sweat dripped down his temple, the lens pressed against his eye. The ocean above shimmered with motion. Dark hulls gliding in formation, flight decks glinting like steel islands. He counted 3 carriers, flanked by destroyers. The bearings aligned perfectly. He whispered the order. Range, 5,000 meters. Depth, maintain 50. Tubes 1 through 6. Ready. The crew responded in ritual precision. Valves opened, gyroscopes whirred to life. The submarine angled slightly, its hull groaning as compressed air filled the ballast tanks. The air grew heavier. Hearts beat faster. Every man aboard knew what came next. Fire 1. A thunderous hiss. The torpedo leapt from its tube, slicing into the depths. Fire 2. Another roar. Then 3, 4, 5, 6. The full spread launched in disciplined sequence. The submarine recoiled from the release, momentarily shuddering as bubbles streamed upward. Kudo lowered the periscope, listening. The seconds stretched like minutes. No one spoke. Then, distant echoes. Low, rolling detonations filtered through the hull. The sound of success? Or of failure? It was impossible to tell. The crew exchanged glances, eyes wide, waiting for the commander's expression. Kudo said nothing. He listened longer. Another boom, sharper, closer. He smiled faintly. Hits confirmed, he said softly, more to himself than to the men. A murmur of restrained triumph filled the control room, but on the surface, nothing burned. The explosions they heard were not impacts. They were depth charges, triggered remotely as the Americans realized the torpedoes had been fired. The illusion was complete. Above the surface, the trap tightens. The U.S. destroyer USS Radford, part of a decoy convoy known internally as Task Group 15D, had detected the torpedo wakes moments after launch. Radar operators had tracked the I-36's periscope earlier that morning, marking its approximate position. When sonar picked up the compressed air bursts of a torpedo launch, the entire formation shifted into response mode. Bearing 180, depth 70 meters, contact confirmed, the sonar officer reported. Captain Thomas H. Robbins gave the order without hesitation. Full speed ahead. Commence depth pattern, bravo! The destroyer's engines roared to life. Within minutes, the sea erupted. Depth charges rolled off stern racks, plunging into the blue. Seconds later, the water convulsed in a column of foam and thunder. To the men aboard the American ships, this was no longer deception. It was precision execution. The decoy carriers maintained formation, ensuring the Japanese submarine believed its attack had succeeded, while the destroyers closed in from multiple angles. Sonar pings pulsed rhythmically through the water, echoing off the ocean floor and steel hulls. Below, the realization inside the I-36, the celebration lasted less than a minute. Then came the first concussion. The submarine jolted violently, lights flickering. A second explosion followed, closer, sharper. Pressure gauges trembled. "Depth charges!" someone shouted. Kudo's calm expression cracked for the first time. "Take her down! 100 meters. Fast! The helmsman spun the wheel. Ballast tanks flooded. The submarine tilted steeply, descending into darkness. Every creak of the hull was a reminder of mortality. A third explosion rocked the vessel, shattering light bulbs, sending glass raining over the control panels. Men covered their ears as the metallic thunder rolled through the compartments. The sound was like the sky collapsing underwater. "Engines ahead, full!" Kudo ordered. "Hard to port!" They tried to escape through depth and silence, hoping to slip beneath the destroyer's sonar cones. But the Americans were no longer guessing. Using triangulation, 2 destroyers closed from opposite sides, trapping the I-36 in a tightening wedge. For every evasive maneuver, a new pattern of depth charges followed. The sea became a hammer, pounding relentlessly. Bulkheads trembled, dials shattered, and a fine mist of diesel and sweat filled the air. Somewhere aft, a mechanic screamed that the battery compartment was flooding. Another shouted that the port motor had failed. Still, Kudo refused to surface. He would not give the Americans the satisfaction of a surrender signal. Then came the most chilling sound of all, the fading hum of sonar replaced by silence. The destroyers had gone quiet. The crew held their breath. Silence in submarine warfare was never peace. It was anticipation. Moments later, the entire world detonated. A cluster of charges exploded directly above, slamming the I-36 downward. Instruments flew from panels. Men were thrown against bulkheads. The lights went out. Only the emergency lamps flickered red. Kudo gripped the periscope handles, blood running from a cut above his eyebrow. He stared into the dark, hearing the ocean groan around him. "Maintain depth," he said quietly. "Do not panic." But inside, every man knew. The Americans had found them. The next minutes unfolded without sound, only vibration, the metallic wail of a dying ship holding on to life. The submarine's descent slowed, then stabilized. Miraculously, the hull held, but they could not rise. Every attempt to surface would bring another attack. Kudo looked at his chart. The coordinates matched perfectly with the reported carrier route. Yet above them was only death. He understood then. The Americans had not been found. They had been waiting, and for the first time, he realized that they had not hunted the enemy. They had followed a ghost. The explosions faded into distant rumbles. Echoing through the blackened compartments, the I-36 drifted at 120 meters, too deep for safety, too shallow for escape. Every groan of the hull was a warning. One more blast, and the ocean would finish what the Americans had begun. Lieutenant Commander Kudo wiped oil and blood from his face. The control room was dimly lit by emergency lamps, casting red shadows over pale faces. Steam hissed from a ruptured valve. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burnt insulation. He leaned over the depth gauge. The needle trembled, steadying near collapse. Behind him, the helmsman muttered a prayer. The others stared at their instruments as though obedience alone might keep the ocean from swallowing them whole. Then came the sound they all dreaded, the high-pitched ping of sonar, faint at first, then sharper, nearer. The Americans were sweeping again. Kudo closed his eyes. "They've lost contact," he said. "They're searching." No one replied. Every word risked death. The sonar pulse grew louder, then paused. Silence. Another pulse. Closer still. The pattern was tightening. "Rig for silent running," Kudo ordered softly. "Engines off." Absolute silence. The hum of the motors faded into stillness. The submarine became a coffin suspended in liquid darkness. Above the surface, the kill pattern on the USS Radford. Sonar operators tracked the faint echoes of a metallic hull drifting south. Captain Robbins watched the oscilloscope trace with steady calm. He'd done this before. Too many times. Target moving slow. Depth approximately 120, reported the operator. Bearing 185. "Deploy Hedgehog pattern." "Mark II," Robbins said. The destroyer's deck crew prepared the forward launchers, spiked projectiles loaded with explosives, designed to detonate only on contact. Unlike depth charges, they allowed no warning. At 0947 hours, the Radford released the pattern. 24 Hedgehog bombs arced through the air, entered the water in silence, and began their deadly descent. Below, the last minutes inside the I-36, the men listened to the returning sonar pings, each one a pulse of approaching death. Kudo stood unmoving, his mind racing through possibilities. Rise and fight? Surface and surrender? Or remain still, hoping the enemy would pass? But the war had left him no illusions. He had seen reports of what awaited captured submariners: interrogation, humiliation, dishonor. No captain of the Imperial Navy would allow that fate. He turned to his executive officer. "Prepare scuttling charges," he said. The officer hesitated. "Sir, we can still—" Kudo raised a hand. "We have fulfilled our orders. There is no shame." Before the man could respond, a dull metallic thud reverberated through the hull. Then another. Then a third. The Hedgehog bombs had found their target. A flash of blinding light tore through the forward torpedo compartment. The blast ripped through the submarine, collapsing bulkheads, igniting oxygen reserves. In seconds, compartments flooded. Men were thrown into darkness and water. Pressure roared in like a living creature, crushing everything in its path. Steel screamed, lights shattered, and voices vanished in a single rising roar. The I-36 broke apart at 140 meters, her bow shearing from the main hull. Debris spiraled upward through a column of bubbles and oil. On the surface, silence. Returns from the bridge of the USS Radford. A single column of bubbles broke the surface, spreading in a widening slick of diesel. No survivors, no wreckage large enough to mark. Captain Robbins removed his cap, standing silently for a moment. His officers said nothing. For them, this was another victory. One line crossed off a chart, one fewer enemy beneath the sea. "Log the contact as confirmed kill," Robbins said quietly. "Resume patrol." The destroyer turned slowly, engines steady, vanishing into the horizon. The surface of the Pacific closed once more. Flat, indifferent, eternal. Beneath the waves, the ocean keeps its secrets. What remained of the I-36 drifted down through darkness, settling on the ocean floor, the compartments filled with silt, papers, and fragments of life. Letters, photos, tools, a small notebook still folded in Kudo's jacket. On its pages were navigation coordinates and a single line in neat handwriting: "To strike once, even if we do not return." No body would ever rise from that depth. No message would reach Tokyo. Only silence. For days afterward, American intelligence noted an absence of radio signals from the area. One by one, other submarines that had been ordered to intercept the same phantom carriers went silent as well. Some destroyed, others retreating to base, confused and empty-handed. The deception had worked far beyond expectation. In the span of weeks, Japan's confidence in its underwater fleet was shattered. What had once been a symbol of precision and reach was now a graveyard of steel ghosts. The Pacific had become America's domain, mapped, watched, and mastered. The age of unseen warfare had changed hands, and somewhere in that cold blue stillness, the wreck of the I-36 rested as a monument not of defeat, but of revelation. For in that moment beneath the waves, the hunter finally understood what it meant to be seen. In Tokyo, the corridors of the Imperial Navy General Staff were silent. A week had passed since the I-36 failed to report. The Signals Division had sent repeated messages. No reply. One by one, other submarines in her flotilla also went dark. The optimism that had followed the plan, the chance to ambush American carriers near the Marshalls, evaporated into unease. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, then commanding the combined fleet's central operations, stared at the intercepted American reports with tightening lips. The pattern was unmistakable. A coordinated U.S. submarine trap combined with false radio traffic and disguised task groups. Japan had been lured into hunting ghosts. What the Americans called Operation Boxcar was never meant to sink ships, only submarines. By transmitting controlled carrier signals from small escort carriers and electronic beacons, U.S. intelligence had created the illusion of a major fleet movement. The Japanese, desperate for a decisive strike, took the bait. In a single month, 5 submarines were lost. I-36, IT-37, I-177, I-183, and I-32. Nearly 400 trained crewmen vanished without trace. The Americans didn't just win a battle. They dismantled Japan's faith in its own undersea network. Intelligence versus instinct post-war records from the U.S. Office of Naval Intelligence revealed the meticulous planning behind the deception. Intercepted Japanese codes had revealed patrol routes and command timings, enabling American destroyers and patrol aircraft to form invisible perimeters. The fake carriers, in reality small task groups with heavy radio chatter, drifted across those routes like baited hooks. Each lost Japanese contact fed more data to U.S. analysts, where they hunted, how they maneuvered, how they died. Meanwhile, within the Imperial Navy, suspicions spread like rust. Commanders began accusing each other of leaking routes or misreading orders. The submarine force, once considered Japan's elite, was now treated as unreliable. Crew morale plummeted. Recruitment slowed. The older officers, veterans of the pre-war era, watched helplessly as their once proud branch turned into a symbol of futility. For many, the loss of the I-36 was personal. She had been among the few boats still capable of long-range patrols deep into the Central Pacific. Her commander, Kudo, had been trained under the old system, disciplined, brilliant, and utterly loyal. His disappearance was more than tactical failure. It was a fracture of faith. The U.S. perspective to the Americans. The destruction of the I-class boats confirmed what they already suspected. Japan's submarines, though advanced, were operating blindly. By 1944, U.S. naval superiority in detection, radar, and encryption had made the Pacific effectively transparent. Every time a Japanese submarine left port, its movements were soon known. American hunter-killer groups, destroyers equipped with new SG radar and HFDF, high-frequency direction finding, hunted them relentlessly. But the most devastating blow was psychological. The Japanese believed they were hunting a fleet. Instead, they had been hunted themselves. In Washington, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz praised the operation not for its kills, but for its precision. "Let the enemy chase shadows," he wrote in a report. "Each time he does, he shows us where to strike next." CTE Pacific had become a chessboard, and Japan was now playing, blindfolded. The loss of I-36 marked a quiet shift in naval doctrine, one that neither side would forget. As the Imperial Navy struggled to rebuild its shattered submarine arm, the Americans refined their art of misinformation, leading to larger operations of deception before the invasions of Saipan and the Philippines. But for those who served below the waves, men like Kudo, the truth came too late. They had not been defeated in combat. They had been deceived into fighting an illusion, and that illusion would define the war's final phase. By early 1944, fragments of truth began to surface. Reports from surviving submarines, those that had turned back early or missed the rendezvous points, began reaching the Yokosuka Naval District. Their captains described strange signals, false radar emissions, phantom engine noises, and empty waters where carrier task forces were supposed to be. Engineers dismissed the stories as coincidence, but the operations staff quietly compiled the accounts, cross-checking them with American broadcast frequencies later intercepted by Japan's own monitoring stations. Slowly, the outline emerged. The enemy had mastered deception on the open ocean. What Japan had believed to be an offensive advantage, stealth, had become its weakness, and the sea, once the Empire's proud hunting ground, was no longer a place of honor. The end of an era, the Submarine Division Command in Kure convened a confidential meeting in April 1944. Charts were spread across tables. Reports from lost boats, including the I-36, were reviewed line by line. Rear Admiral Shigaki Yamazaki, himself a veteran of earlier patrols, studied the data in silence. He saw a pattern of precision, not luck. Each disappearance matched the coordinates of known American reconnaissance zones. "Gentlemen," he finally said, "our enemy does not merely fight. He listens." It was an admission few dared to speak. Japanese communications, once considered unbreakable, were being read in real time. The Americans didn't need to see Japan's submarines to destroy them. They could simply predict where they would go. The conclusion was devastating. Japan's undersea campaign, designed for ambush and isolation tactics, had no defense against an enemy who could hear every whisper of its strategy. Within months, the Imperial Navy began diverting submarines from offensive patrols to desperate supply missions, ferrying food and ammunition to stranded island garrisons. Submariners who had once dreamed of sinking carriers were now hauling rice and medicine through blockades. For men trained to strike, it felt like humiliation. Yet for Japan's high command, there was no alternative. The legacy of the I-36, the loss of the I-36 became symbolic within naval circles. Not for her tonnage or her kills, but for the manner of her death. In post-war memoirs, several surviving officers described her as the mirror of our arrogance. She represented a navy too proud to question its own intelligence, too desperate to believe in a decisive victory. When the war ended in 1945, her coordinates were still classified by both sides. American records noted her probable resting place, but did not confirm it until decades later, when sonar mapping expeditions began scanning the deep trenches east of the Marshalls. There, more than 1,000 meters down, divers found fragments of pressure hull and rusted deck plating, likely the remnants of the I-36. Her torpedo tubes remained sealed. None had fired. She had gone to her death with her weapons loaded and unfired, proof that she had never been given a real target. Japan's silent graveyard by war's end. 128 Japanese submarines had been lost. Only a handful returned home intact. Of those, many were scuttled by their own crews to prevent capture. The men who survived lived with a shared silence. Some joined the new Maritime Self-Defense Force years later. Others refused to speak of their service again. To them, the ocean remained both a battlefield and a grave. American reports, declassified in the 1970s, revealed how successful the deception program had been. Operations like Boxcar, Galvanic, and later Forager all used false signals to lure Japanese forces into empty seas. What had once seemed impossible, manipulating enemy perception across thousands of miles of ocean, became standard doctrine in modern naval warfare. The I-36, though forgotten by name, marked the moment that change began. As the Pacific War entered its final year, Japan's undersea fleet no longer hunted. It merely endured. And somewhere far below the waves, the twisted hull of a lost submarine rested in darkness, her mission unfulfilled, her crew still waiting for an enemy that had never truly been there. The silence around her was not defeat. It was revelation. The war in the Pacific was fought on maps and islands, but it was decided in silence, in the frequencies no one could hear, and in the shadows no one could see. The fate of the I-36 was not unique. It was a single thread in a larger tapestry of illusion, where the line between hunter and hunted blurred beneath miles of ocean. For every torpedo launched, there were 100 messages intercepted, decoded, and used to turn courage into vulnerability. In that sense, the submarine war was not just a contest of steel and fire, it was a battle of perception. Whoever understood the unseen first ruled the sea. The Americans did not defeat Japan's submariners through brute force. They dismantled their belief, the faith that discipline and honor alone could prevail against a listening enemy. Technology had outgrown valor, and the men who lived by silence were undone by those who mastered it. When divers later descended to the resting places of Japan's sunken boats, they found no relics of victory, only traces of endurance. Helmets, compasses, logbooks sealed in silt. Each submarine became a monument not of glory, but of devotion, of men who followed their orders to the end, never knowing that the sea itself had been turned against them. Today, the rusted hull of the I-36 lies among coral and sand, her numbers fading with the tide. Yet she remains a symbol, not of failure, but of transformation. Because in her story, modern naval warfare was reborn. From that silence came sonar, from deception, electronic warfare, from loss, understanding. War, after all, is not merely fought with weapons. It is fought with information, with what is known, and what is believed to be known. And in the vast stillness of the Pacific, the echo of that lesson endures. Even the hunter must learn to see beyond the illusion,